Viking raids, a deep dive into their battles and conquests. The Vikings, fierce warriors, fearless explorers, the ruthless raiders, left a mark on history that still echoes today. From the icy fjords of Scandinavia, they launched daring raids, striking terror into the hearts of medieval Europe. But who were they really? What made their war machines so effective? How did they conquer, plunder, and expand their reach across continents? Stay with us as we get into the legendary Viking conquests, battle tactics, and the secrets behind their unstoppable war machine. Smash that like button, and let's set sail into history. Who were the Vikings? The Vikings were far more than just bloodthirsty raiders. They were farmers, traders, shipbuilders, and explorers who came from the Scandinavian regions of modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Their era, known as the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 CE, was defined by a mix of exploration, conquest, and cultural expansion that stretched far beyond their northern homelands. But why did the Vikings set sail in the first place? Several factors played a role. Scandinavia's harsh climate and limited farmland meant that resources were scarce, and population growth made it increasingly difficult for younger generations to inherit land. This economic pressure pushed many Vikings to look outward, seeking new opportunities through raiding, trading, and settlement. Additionally, the fragmented political landscape of medieval Europe made monasteries, villages, and even entire kingdoms easy targets for Viking warbands. Unlike many of their contemporaries, Vikings had no single ruler or centralized empire. Instead, they were organized into clans and small kingdoms, led by chieftains or jarls. Power was often determined by wealth and military strength, which meant that successful raiders could gain influence and even establish their own territories abroad. Some Vikings sought fortune through plundering, while others became mercenaries, serving as elite warriors for foreign rulers. One of the defining features of Viking society was its warrior culture. Honor and reputation were everything. A Viking's deeds in battle determined how they were remembered, both in life and in the afterlife. Their mythology reflected this obsession with heroism. Dying in combat meant being chosen by the Valkyries to feast in Valhalla, the grand hall of Odin. This belief in a glorious afterlife made Vikings fearless in battle, willing to fight to the last breath rather than surrender. Despite their violent reputation, Vikings were also skilled traders, who built vast networks spanning from the British Isles to the Middle East. They established trade routes that connected Europe with the Islamic Caliphate, the Byzantine Empire, and even parts of Central Asia. Silver, furs, slaves, and spices were just some of the goods they traded, proving that the Vikings were not just warriors, but also shrewd businessmen. While many Vikings settled in foreign lands, their culture and language spread with them. They established Norse colonies in Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, centuries before Christopher Columbus set sail. Viking influence is still visible today, from place names in England to words in the English language like berserk and ransack. Though they started as raiders, the Vikings ultimately transformed into settlers, rulers, and even kings in lands they once attacked. Over time, they assimilated into European societies, blending Norse traditions with local cultures, but their legacy as fierce, adventurous seafarers remains. Their age of conquest was only beginning. The first raids. The monasteries burn. The Viking Age truly began with a moment that sent shockwaves through medieval Europe, the infamous raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 CE. Before this event, the Vikings were not widely known outside of Scandinavia, but in one swift and brutal attack, they announced their arrival as a terrifying new force. Lindisfarne, a small island off the northeast coast of England, was home to a Christian monastery, known for its wealth and religious significance. Monasteries like Lindisfarne were ideal targets for Viking raiders. They were filled with golden relics, finely decorated manuscripts, and other treasures, yet they had no defences. Monks were not warriors. They lived peaceful lives of prayer and scholarship, making them easy prey for battle-hardened Norsemen. When the Vikings struck Lindisfarne, they came without warning. Longships, Their sleek and fast vessels allowed them to appear suddenly along the coastlines and rivers. Before anyone could react, the raiders stormed the monastery, killing monks, looting its treasures, and burning parts of the site to the ground. Some monks were taken as slaves, dragged back to Scandinavia to be sold in markets or kept as servants. News of the raid spread quickly, terrifying the Christian kingdoms of Europe. This attack was just the beginning. The following decade saw Viking raiders strike repeatedly across the British Isles and beyond. Their targets were often similar: monasteries and isolated villages, where they could take gold, silver, and livestock and captives with little resistance. These early raids followed a consistent pattern: hit fast, take what they could carry, and escape before local forces could mount a defence. This strategy made them nearly impossible to stop. Other monasteries soon suffered the same fate as Lindisfarne. The island monastery of Iona, off the coast of Scotland, was raided multiple times between 795 and 806 CE, with dozens of monks slaughtered. In Ireland, Vikings attacked the monastery of Clonmacnoise, one of the most important religious centres in the region. Over time, these raids evolved from small hit-and-run attacks into full-scale invasions. By the mid-9th century, Viking warbands were no longer just stealing treasure, they were seizing entire territories. European rulers struggled to defend against these sudden attacks. Many local armies were slow to mobilize, and by the time they arrived, the Vikings were often already gone. As a result, some kings and nobles resorted to paying the Vikings off, offering large sums of silver, known as Danegeld, in exchange for peace. However, this only encouraged more raids, as the Vikings realized that they could demand even greater payments each time. The Viking raids on monasteries marked the first stage of their expansion. What began as opportunistic plundering soon transformed into something even more ambitious. Large-scale invasions led to Viking settlements in kingdoms abroad. As the raiders gained more experience and confidence, they turned their attention to even greater prizes: the wealthy cities and vast lands of England and France. Viking battle tactics and weapons. The Vikings were not just raiders and explorers. They were skilled warriors who dominated battlefields across Europe for centuries. Their success in combat was not due to sheer numbers alone, but to their superior weapons, strategic battle formations, and a fierce warrior culture that struck fear into their enemies. At the heart of Viking combat was their weaponry. The most iconic Viking weapon was the axe. Unlike swords, which were expensive to make and reserved for wealthier warriors, axes were cheap, versatile, and devastating in battle. A well-forged axe could split shields, break bones, and even cut through helmets. Some Vikings used massive two-handed axes, Dane axes, which allowed them to swing with incredible force, making them a terrifying presence on the battlefield. While axes were common, swords were a symbol of prestige. Viking swords were well crafted, often decorated with intricate designs, and passed down through generations. These swords were typically double-edged and used with one hand, allowing the warrior to wield a shield in the other. The best swords were made from high-quality steel, sometimes imported from the Frankish kingdoms, and could last through many battles. However, only the wealthiest Vikings could afford these prized weapons. Spears were another essential weapon in Viking warfare. They were easy to make, had excellent reach, and could be used for thrusting in close combat and for throwing at enemies before charging. Skilled warriors could hurl their spears with deadly accuracy, striking down foes from a distance. Bows and arrows, though not as heavily associated with Viking warriors, were also widely used, especially in the early stages of battle or during sieges. Beyond individual weapons, Viking success in combat was largely due to their disciplined battle tactics. One of the most effective formations was the shield wall. In this strategy, warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, locking their shields together to create a nearly impenetrable barrier. This formation allowed them to absorb enemy attacks while waiting for the right moment to strike back. When used effectively, the shield wall turned Viking warbands into a solid, moving fortress that could hold back much larger forces. Among the Viking warriors, a special group stood out: the Berserkers. These were legendary fighters who fought with an almost supernatural rage, entering a trance-like state that made them fearless and seemingly immune to pain. Berserkers were said to wear animal skins, howl like wolves, and charge into battle with reckless abandon. Their wild fighting style made them both feared and respected, as they could break enemy lines with sheer ferocity. Viking battle tactics were more than just brute strength. They relied on speed and deception. Raids were carefully planned, often taking advantage of surprise and quick retreats. Their longships allowed them to strike deep into enemy territory, using rivers and coastal routes, attacking where defences were weakest. This combination of superior weapons, tactical discipline, and relentless aggression made the Vikings one of the most formidable warriors of the medieval world. Conquering England and France. As Viking raids evolved from small-scale hit-and-run attacks into full-scale invasions, England and France became prime targets for conquest. No longer content with plundering, Viking leaders began to carve out entire territories, establishing long-lasting settlements and even ruling over foreign lands. In England, the turning point came in 865 CE, with the arrival of the Great Heathen Army. Unlike earlier raids, which involved a few ships attacking coastal monasteries and villages, this invasion was an organised military campaign, led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Uber. The Viking force consisted of thousands of warriors, determined to conquer rather than just pillage. Over the next decade, the Great Heathen Army swept through England, capturing major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and forcing local rulers into submission. One of the biggest victories came in 866 CE, when the Vikings captured Jorvik, a key city in Northumbria. This marked the beginning of Norse rule in parts of England, with Viking leaders establishing their own governments and integrating into the local economy. Viking rule in England was not just about warfare. It also brought trade, cultural exchange, and new administrative systems. However, their conquest was far from total. In the late 9th century, King Alfred of Wessex managed to push back against Viking forces, eventually leading to a division of England into Anglo-Saxon and Viking-controlled territories, known as the Danelaw. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, Viking ambitions extended into the Frankish kingdom. One of the most dramatic moments in Viking history was the Siege of Paris in 845 CE, led by the famous Viking chieftain Ragnar Lothbrok. A fleet of 120 Viking longships sailed up the River Seine, reaching the heart of the Frankish kingdom. The city's defences were no match for the battle-hardened Norse warriors, and the Franks were forced to pay an enormous ransom to prevent their capital from being completely destroyed. This set a precedent for future Viking raids of France. Rather than resisting, the Frankish rulers often found it easier to pay off the invaders with massive sums of silver and gold. Eventually, Viking raids in France led to a more permanent settlement. In 911 CE, King Charles the Simple of West Francia struck a deal with the Viking leader Rollo, granting him land in northern France, in exchange for protection against further invasions. The region became known as Normandy, literally Land of the Northmen, and over time, the Norse settlers integrated into Frankish society, adopting local customs, language and Christianity. Rollo's descendants, the Normans, would later rise to power in Europe, playing a crucial role in the Norman conquest of England in 1066. The Viking conquests of England and France reshaped European history. Their influence extended beyond warfare, leaving a lasting impact on the political landscape, trade and culture. Though their reign as conquerors eventually faded, the Vikings' legacy lived on through the kingdoms and dynasties they helped establish. The end of the Viking Age. For nearly 3 centuries, the Vikings dominated Europe with their raids, conquests and explorations. However, by the late 11th century, the Viking Age came to an end. The very forces that had once made them unstoppable, military prowess, seafaring skill and adventurous spirit, were now countered by stronger European defences, political shifts, and the gradual assimilation of the Vikings into the societies they once raided. One of the key reasons Viking raids declined was the growing strength of European kingdoms. In the early Viking Age, the fractured natures of medieval Europe made it easy for Norse raiders to attack isolated monasteries and small settlements. However, by the late 10th and 11th centuries, France, England and the Holy Roman Empire had developed more centralized governments and stronger armies. Kings began investing in fortified towns, stone castles, and professional standing armies, making it harder for Viking forces to plunder with impunity. Christianity also played a major role in the decline of Viking aggression. Early Viking societies were rooted in Norse paganism, with gods like Odin and Thor inspiring their warrior culture. However, as Vikings settled in places like Normandy, England and Ireland, they gradually adopted Christianity. Missionary efforts and political alliances led many Norse rulers to convert, and with the conversion came a shift in priorities. Christian Vikings were less likely to raid monasteries, and as the faith spread throughout Scandinavia, the religious justification for Viking raids weakened. By the 12th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion in all Viking territories, effectively ending their pagan warrior traditions. The Viking expansion into England also contributed to their decline. The early Viking raids were swift and strategic, but by the late 9th century, they sought permanent control over large territories. The Great Heathen Army of 865 CE successfully conquered much of England, but the English kingdoms, particularly Wessex, fought back. Under King Alfred the Great, the Anglo-Saxons reorganized their defences, building fortified towns called burhs. Successive English rulers, like Athelstan and later Edward the Confessor, continued pushing the Vikings out. By 954 CE, the last Viking ruler of York, Eric Bloodaxe, was killed, marking the end of the Norse rule in England. One of the defining moments that signalled the end of the Viking Age was the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. King Harald Hardrada of Norway, one of the last great Viking warriors, attempted to seize the English throne, but was met by the forces of King Harold Godwinson. Despite his experience and reputation, Hardrada's army was caught off guard and suffered a crushing defeat. This battle marked the last major Viking attempt at conquest in England. While Viking raids ceased, their legacy endured. Many former Viking territories, like Normandy and parts of England, were ruled by Norse-descended elites. The Normans, themselves Viking descendants, would go on to conquer England later that same year in the famous Battle of Hastings. The Viking Age may have ended, but the impact of their culture, seafaring skills and warrior traditions shaped Europe for centuries to come. And that's the story of the Vikings. Game changers in history. Their influence is still felt today, from the words we speak to the stories we tell. So, what do you think? Were the Vikings the greatest warriors of their time, or just ruthless invaders? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this unpacking of Viking history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more epic history content.